In the year 476, the deposition of the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, fractured a unified Mediterranean economic zone that had endured for half a millennium. The sprawling network of paved roads, deep-water ports, and heavily guarded caravan routes that linked the damp forests of Britannia to the bustling markets of Alexandria began to disintegrate. Without imperial legions to patrol the highways or a centralized bureaucracy to maintain the harbors, long-distance commerce stalled. Stone bridges collapsed, and vital mountain passes fell into the hands of local warlords. Western Europe fractured into localized, unstable Germanic kingdoms. The Mediterranean Sea, once a secure superhighway for Roman merchant fleets, transformed into a contested maritime frontier plagued by Vandal raiders and severe political fragmentation. This geopolitical collapse severed European access to the lucrative Eastern Mediterranean and Asian trade routes. Spices, silks, and precious commodities from the Indian Ocean abruptly ceased flowing into the great western cities of Rome, Massilia, and Londinium. Among these disappearing luxuries was a crystalline substance that had commanded astronomical prices in the markets of antiquity: cane sugar. First cultivated in the Indian subcontinent and later refined by Persian agronomists, cane sugar, or saccharum, had reached the Roman aristocracy as an exotic pharmaceutical and a culinary status symbol. Pliny the Elder had documented this imported Indian sugar, describing it as a brittle, white salt used exclusively by the wealthy for medicinal compounding. Roman merchants had paid fortunes in silver to secure small shipments transported overland through the Parthian Empire or sailed up the Red Sea to Egyptian ports before crossing the Mediterranean. When the Western Roman administration collapsed, the intricate supply chain required to move Persian and Indian sugar across thousands of miles dissolved entirely. The newly established Ostrogothic and Frankish kings possessed neither the diplomatic leverage nor the silver reserves to maintain regular trade with the East. By the early 6th century, cane sugar vanished from Western European apothecas and noble estates. The sudden absence of this imported luxury created an immediate caloric and culinary vacuum across the continent. With no indigenous sugarcane, no reliable access to Eastern markets, and a cooling climate that restricted the cultivation of sweet fruits, European populations faced an acute crisis of resources. Stripped of global imports, Western Europe was forced to rely entirely on regional apiculture. Honey transitioned rapidly from a common agricultural byproduct to the sole source of concentrated caloric sweetening available to millions of people. Peasant farmers and newly established feudal estates expanded their cultivation of the dark European honey bee, Apis mellifera mellifera, adapting to a localized survival economy. Forests and meadows, previously cleared for vast Roman grain estates, began to reclaim the landscape. This advancing wilderness inadvertently created ideal foraging environments for wild and domesticated bee colonies. Men ventured into these dense, untamed woodlands to track feral swarms, capturing them in cloth sacks and bringing them back to the village commons. Skeps, domed, woven baskets made of straw, bound with briar, and sealed with animal dung, became a ubiquitous feature of medieval settlements. For the serf bound to the land, honey provided crucial winter calories when grain harvests failed or cold rains rotted the root vegetables. For the regional lord, it represented a vital, non-perishable resource that could be stored in sealed earthen jars for years without spoiling. The apiary became an essential fixture of agrarian survival, carefully managed during the spring nectar flow and fiercely protected throughout the harsh winter months. This widespread reliance on the bee fundamentally altered the rural economy of the early Middle Ages. Without sugar to preserve fruits or mask the taste of spoiling meat, honey became the indispensable preservative and culinary base of the European diet. Contemporary legal codes reflect this drastic elevation in value, treating the insect as a high-value state asset. The Salic Law, compiled under the Frankish King Clovis I, prescribed severe financial penalties for anyone caught stealing a hive or extracting honey from another man's forest enclosure. A thief caught removing an active swarm faced fines of up to 45 solidi, a penalty equivalent to the theft of a highly trained warhorse or a herd of prized cattle. Magistrates presided over tribunals specifically designed to mediate disputes over swarms that had crossed property lines. As the agrarian base adapted to an apiary-centric economy, the ruling classes of early medieval Europe elevated honey to the center of their political and cultural rituals. Germanic and Celtic societies, asserting their dominance over the former Roman provinces, institutionalized mead as the primary ceremonial beverage of the nobility. Fermented from water, wild yeast, and honey, mead required massive quantities of raw sweetener to produce, making it an inherently expensive and prestigious drink. The brewing process demanded precise temperature control and months of aging in wooden casks, ensuring that only the wealthiest households could afford to maintain a steady, reliable supply. In the great timber halls of the Saxons, the Franks, and the Norse, the distribution of mead served as a critical mechanism for binding warriors to their chieftains. A lord demonstrated his wealth, projected his political power, and secured the absolute loyalty of his retinue by dispensing high-quality, aged mead from drinking horns ornamented with silver and gold. Epic poetry from the period, such as the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf and the Welsh epic Y Gododdin, frequently centers the action within these towering mead halls. The poets portray the fermented honey drink as the catalyst for diplomatic oaths, declarations of war, and the forging of military alliances. Warriors swore their fealty over the rim of the mead cup, binding their fate to their leader in exchange for a share of his wealth and his honey wine. The consumption of mead strictly separated the aristocracy from the peasantry, who subsisted primarily on weak, localized barley alesh or cider. To supply the staggering volumes of mead required for a single royal banquet, early medieval kings demanded honey as direct tribute from conquered territories and subordinate lords. When the Anglo-Saxon King Iani of Wessex codified his laws in the late 7th century, he mandated that specific estates pay their food rent not in silver coinage, but in fixed vats of clear, strained honey. This aggressive taxation system forced a massive expansion of beekeeping across the British Isles and the European continent, transforming apiculture into a state-managed enterprise driven relentlessly by the thirst of the warrior elite. While secular lords demanded honey for fermentation and feasting, another powerful institution recognized the strategic necessity of the bee. As the remnants of Roman urban civilization faded, the Catholic Church consolidated its political and spiritual influence through a rapidly expanding network of rural monasteries. Following the rule of Saint Benedict, these isolated monastic communities prioritized complete self-sufficiency. Abbots sought to sever their reliance on the unpredictable external markets, dangerous road networks, and volatile local warlords of the early Middle Ages. Monasteries required an uninterrupted, localized supply of essential resources to maintain their rigid daily routines, and apiculture quickly became a cornerstone of monastic agricultural planning. Monks began constructing heavily fortified, walled apiaries within their cloistered grounds. These specialized stone enclosures, designed with recessed alcoves called bee bowls, protected the fragile straw skeps from harsh winter winds and driving rain. More importantly, the thick walls and heavy oak doors secured the highly valuable hives from the dual threats of peasant theft and the pervasive European brown bear, which frequently decimated unprotected forest colonies in search of brood and honey. The immense monastic investment in apiculture was driven by a dual necessity. First, the infirmaries required a massive, constant supply of pure honey. Drawing on surviving fragments of Roman medical texts preserved in their libraries, monastic apothecaries utilized honey as their primary pharmaceutical base. They compounded it with medicinal herbs grown in the cloister gardens to treat severe respiratory infections, applied it directly to festering wounds and battle scars as a potent antimicrobial dressing, and used it to preserve medicinal roots through the long, freezing northern winters. Second, and perhaps more crucially to the life of the church, the bishops required beeswax. Unlike the smoky, foul-smelling tallow candles rendered from animal fat that illuminated peasant hovels, beeswax burned with a clean, bright flame and emitted a sweet floral odor. Early Christian theology firmly associated the virginity of the worker bee with the purity of the Virgin Mary, making beeswax the only acceptable material for illuminating the high altar and the sacred, hand-copied manuscripts of the scriptorium. A single major abbey required thousands of pounds of wax annually to maintain its rigorous liturgical schedule, forcing the monks to breed and manage hundreds of active hives simultaneously. To coordinate this massive production, monasteries appointed specialized agricultural officers, known as apiarians. These monks devoted their entire lives to the study of swarming patterns, the seasonal cultivation of nectar-rich gardens, and the delicate, dangerous extraction of combs. They engineered leather protective gear, developed smoke bellows to sedate aggressive colonies, and forged specialized iron tools to harvest the wax without destroying the crucial brood. By the 8th century, abbeys stretching from the rugged coast of Ireland to the deep alpine passes of Bavaria had accumulated vast, highly guarded surpluses of both honey and wax, transforming them into formidable economic powerhouses. Their stone-walled apiaries hummed with intense, organized labor, heavily patrolled by the brethren who recognized that their light, their medicine, and their institutional wealth now depended entirely on the harvest of the hive. Monastic wagons, loaded heavily with excess wax blocks and sealed clay amphorae of honey, began slowly making their way along the muddy, rutted roads of Western Europe, heading toward the regional episcopal courts to fulfill the massive, growing demands of the expanding church hierarchy. In March 742, Carloman, the powerful Frankish mayor of the palace, summoned the highest ecclesiastical and secular authorities of his realm to the Council of Estins. Guided by the influential Anglo-Saxon missionary Saint Boniface, the synod aimed to aggressively reform a fractured and decentralized Frankish church. Among the sweeping disciplinary measures enacted, the council issued a strict liturgical mandate that permanently altered the European agrarian economy. The bishops decreed that all Catholic churches across the vast Frankish territories must exclusively use pure beeswax candles for the celebration of the Mass and the illumination of the high altars. Prior to this council, struggling rural parishes and impoverished dioceses frequently relied on tallow to light their sanctuaries. Rendered from the boiled fat of slaughtered sheep and cattle, tallow candles provided cheap, accessible illumination. They also produced thick, greasy smoke that coated religious frescoes in heavy black soot and filled the enclosed stone basilicas with the sharp, rancid odor of burning animal flesh. Beeswax, by contrast, burned with a brilliant, steady flame and emitted a clean, sweet floral scent. Furthermore, the early medieval church maintained a strict theological association between the perceived virginity of the worker bee and the physical purity of the Virgin Mary. Saint Boniface and the assembled bishops determined that only this immaculate substance was worthy of illuminating the Eucharist. This single theological decree generated an immediate, staggering institutional demand for a resource that barely existed in commercial quantities. A single major cathedral required hundreds of pounds of high-quality wax annually to supply the altar, illuminate the scriptorium, and observe the endless cycle of vigil feasts. The scattered small-scale forest beekeepers of the 8th century lacked the infrastructure, the protective gear, and the organized labor required to meet such a colossal quota. The secular supply chain buckled almost instantly under the weight of the church's strict new requirements. Recognizing the severe deficit, rural monasteries rapidly mobilized their extensive agricultural labor forces to fill the void. Benedictine abbots ordered the clearing of vast tracts of timberland specifically to establish dedicated, large-scale apiaries. Lay brothers wove hundreds of domed straw skeps, sealing them with clay, and positioning them near newly cultivated fields of clover and flowering herbs. To extract the mandated wax, the monastic apiarians faced a rigid physiological reality. A colony of bees must consume an estimated 8 pounds of liquid nectar to secrete a single pound of wax scales. Consequently, cultivating enough bees to satisfy the massive liturgical wax quotas inevitably resulted in the massive overproduction of honey. The monasteries suddenly found themselves possessing vast, highly profitable surpluses of premium caloric sweetener. While the wax flowed upward to the episcopal palaces and cathedrals, the monks retained the liquid honey. They constructed deep, specialized cellars designed exclusively to store hundreds of heavy wooden vats filled with the viscous gold. Monastic apothecaries filtered the raw harvest through dense linen sacks, skimming off the debris to produce high-grade medicinal syrups. The cellarers fermented the lower-quality comb scrapings into potent, long-lasting mead, ensuring the caloric energy of the harvest could endure the harsh northern winters without spoiling. Through sheer organizational discipline, the abbeys established a near-absolute monopoly over the regional sweetener trade. Long lines of heavy monastic wagons, heavily laden with sealed clay amphorae of honey, routinely departed the cloister gates bound for the major urban markets of the Rhine and the Loire valleys. Urban bakers, apothecaries, and secular nobility found themselves entirely dependent upon the monastic agricultural machine to secure their essential culinary provisions. By 800, the geopolitical landscape of Western Europe had shifted radically under the military expansion of Charlemagne. Having consolidated an immense empire stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, the Carolingian ruler recognized the extreme concentration of wealth accumulating within the monastic walls. Seeking to capture this lucrative revenue stream for the secular state, Charlemagne enacted sweeping administrative reforms. He dictated the Capitulaire de Villiers, a comprehensive imperial manifesto strictly regulating the management, agricultural output, and financial accounting of every royal estate within his vast domain. The emperor explicitly targeted the apiculture monopoly. Chapter 40 of the imperial edict formally mandated the permanent stationing of highly trained, specialized beekeepers, known as apiculators, on every crown property. Charlemagne refused to rely solely on the clerical supply chain for his courtly banquets or his military provisions. He forced his estate managers to cultivate their own massive apiaries, bringing the systematic production of wax and honey under direct imperial control. Chapter 62 of the Capitulaire introduced rigorous, unyielding accounting standards. Charlemagne deployed trusted royal stewards, the Missi Dominici, to physically audit the agricultural yields of his decentralized empire. These mounted imperial inspectors rode systematically from villa to villa, carrying heavy bronze scales and leather-bound ledgers. They interrogated the estate managers, meticulously counted the active straw skeps, and weighed the rendered blocks of yellow wax. They recorded the exact volume of liquid honey held in the storehouses, ensuring that every drop belonged ultimately to the crown. The emperor demanded immediate, aggressive production, legally transforming the localized craft of beekeeping into an audited, regulated instrument of Carolingian state power. Peasants found themselves legally bound to strict, unforgiving annual quotas. A typical tenant farmer owed his lord several modii, a standard medieval volume measurement of strained, high-quality honey every autumn. To survive this crushing tax burden, villagers frantically expanded their own domestic hives. They constructed simple, hollowed-out log hives, known as gums, placing them under the eaves of their thatched cottages to protect them from the rain. During the spring swarming season, peasant families abandoned their plows to chase erratic clouds of bees across the meadows, desperately trying to capture the insects before they vanished into the dense canopy of the local forests. This intense imperial commodification rapidly trickled down to the lowest strata of medieval society. The Carolingian economy suffered from a severe deficit of minted silver coinage, making standard financial transactions nearly impossible in the remote rural provinces. Due to its non-perishable nature, immense caloric value, and steady institutional demand, honey emerged as a dominant liquid currency. Regional lords, following the emperor's administrative blueprint, began assessing their feudal rents not in scarce silver pennies, but in precise volumes of raw sweetener. When domestic yields failed due to late frosts or heavy summer rains, desperate peasants ventured deep into the unmapped woodlands. Armed with smoking bundles of damp moss and crude iron axes, they scaled towering oak trees to locate and harvest feral colonies. This wild foraging carried immense physical risks. Men regularly suffered crippling falls, endured severe allergic reactions from hundreds of defensive stings, and faced violent encounters with European brown bears competing for the exact same resource. Yet, failing to deliver the required wax and honey to the estate manager meant defaulting on feudal obligations, a crime punished by immediate eviction, the confiscation of livestock, or brutal physical flogging at the manor pillory. The extraordinary value placed on these colonies quickly transformed a single, woven skep into a highly targeted, transportable asset. A heavy, active hive represented months of peasant labor and possessed significant taxable value on the black market. Organized banditry and opportunistic thievery plagued the rural apiaries. Desperate men launched coordinated nighttime raids against unprotected village commons. The intruders worked quickly in the dark, violently smashing the fragile straw domes, slaughtering the sleeping worker bees, and vanishing into the timberlands with the stolen wax and honey before the village watch could sound the alarm. To protect their vital economic lifelines, monastic estates and secular lords initiated massive, highly expensive fortification projects. Abbots ordered teams of stonemasons to construct towering, defensive enclosures specifically designed to house the flying livestock. These specialized bee gardens featured thick, mortared walls embedded with sharp iron spikes or tightly woven briar hedges to deter men and wild predators. Blacksmiths forged heavy, complex iron locks to secure the thick oak gates of the apiary yards. Inside, the hives rested safely within deep stone niches, shielded from both the harsh winter gales and the eyes of local poachers. The abbeys completely militarized their agricultural operations. They assigned trusted, armed lay brothers to physically patrol the perimeters of the bee enclosures from dusk until dawn. These monastic guards held long spears and carried iron lanterns, listening intently for the sound of snapping twigs or the low, agitated hum of a disturbed colony. Secular lords followed this defensive blueprint, deploying their own heavily armed gamekeepers to protect the manorial apiaries. As the value of the hives continued to climb, local magistrates enacted brutal legal codes aimed specifically at honey thieves, prescribing blinding, the severing of hands, or immediate execution for anyone caught trespassing within a marked bee garden. The landscape of Western Europe fundamentally shifted as the nobility aggressively claimed total ownership over the wilderness. Feudal lords dispatched armed riders to secure their territorial borders, fiercely asserting their exclusive legal right to every wild swarm and hollow tree within their vast domains. This rapid, militarized enclosure of the woodlands abruptly severed the common peasantry from their traditional, ancestral foraging grounds. Violent skirmishes erupted beneath the heavy forest canopy as desperate commoners, struggling to meet their crushing taxation quotas, directly clashed with the armored retainers of the landed elite. In the late 11th century, the bustling coastal port of Salerno in southern Italy emerged as the premier medical nexus of the Mediterranean world. A merchant-turned-monk named Constantine the African arrived at the Scola Medica Salernitana, carrying heavy wooden chests filled with unread Arabic manuscripts. He had spent decades traveling across the markets of North Africa and the Levant, aggressively acquiring complex medical treatises compiled by Islamic scholars. Retreating to the nearby Abbey of Monte Cassino, Constantine devoted his remaining years to translating these texts into Latin. His exhaustive work formally reintroduced the sophisticated principles of classical Galenic medicine to a European continent, that had largely lost the anatomical knowledge of antiquity. Through these carefully translated folios, European clerics and university scholars discovered that the greatest medical minds of the Islamic Golden Age relied upon honey as a foundational, indispensable pharmaceutical base. The Galenic medical framework dictated that human health depended entirely on maintaining a precise internal equilibrium among four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness occurred when extreme environmental conditions, poor diet, or traumatic injury caused these vital fluids to fall out of balance. University-trained physicians studied the newly translated Arabic texts and formally classified honey according to its specific humoral properties, designating the sweetener as inherently hot and dry in the second degree. Armed with this codified classification, medieval apothecaries began mandating the use of strained honey for compounding specialized medicines. Operating from cramped, aromatic urban storefronts, they utilized the heavy liquid as an essential excipient. They vigorously crushed bitter herbs, ground dried roots, and pulverized mineral salts in heavy bronze mortars, using the viscous sweetener to bind the harsh powders into easily swallowable pills and soothing throat electuaries. Beyond internal medicine, the translated treatises revolutionized European battlefield surgery. Master surgeons attached to noble households and mercenary companies adopted honey as their primary topical treatment for severe lacerations, crushing blows, and deep puncture wounds. They observed that packing a deep sword thrust or a jagged spear wound with crystallized honey prevented the onset of putrefaction and accelerated the growth of healthy new flesh. The high sugar concentration and low water content of the substance effectively starved necrotic bacteria, acting as a potent, natural antimicrobial agent long before the modern understanding of microbiology. Surgeons applied the viscous liquid directly to the traumatized tissue before suturing the torn skin with silk threads. Field medics routinely saturated heavy linen bandages in boiled honey before wrapping the shattered limbs of soldiers, saving thousands of wounded men from fatal post-operative infections and aggressive gangrene. As the European medical establishment enshrined honey within its pharmacopoeia, a massive military expedition profoundly altered the continent's relationship with sweeteners. In 1099, the exhausted, blood-soaked armies of the First Crusade successfully breached the towering limestone walls of Jerusalem, capturing the Holy City after a brutal siege. Marching through the coastal plains of the Levant, the surviving Christian knights encountered sprawling, irrigated agricultural estates cultivating a strange, tall grass entirely unknown in the West. The chronicler Albert of Aachen recorded the actions of the starving crusaders, noting how they aggressively stripped the tough outer bark from these thick stalks and chewed the fibrous core to extract a profoundly sweet juice. They had discovered sugarcane. Islamic agronomists had cultivated the crop extensively across Syria and Palestine, utilizing massive stone mills driven by heavy water wheels to crush the reeds and boil the extracted sap into crystallized blocks. When the veteran crusaders finally boarded the Venetian and Genoese galleys to return to their northern homelands, they loaded their holds with heavily guarded chests of this refined eastern sugar. The sudden introduction of Levantine cane sugar into the markets of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire created an immediate, powerful culinary rival to native European honey. Italian maritime republics quickly monopolized the transport of the crystalline luxury, demanding exorbitant sums in silver for a single imported ounce. Because of its staggering cost and exotic origins, sugar immediately became the ultimate status symbol for the highest echelons of the European aristocracy. Noble households proudly displayed towering, intricate sugar sculptures on their banquet tables, utilizing the rare imported spice to project vast wealth, worldly sophistication, and direct connections to the highly lucrative Mediterranean trade networks. Despite the rising prestige of cane sugar among the ultra-rich, its prohibitive price ensured that honey remained the undisputed caloric engine of the broader European economy. Seeking to capitalize on the massive local reserves of forest and apiary honey, urban bakers across Central Europe began engineering entirely new culinary staples. Working in suffocatingly hot communal bakehouses, they combined immense quantities of dark, robust buckwheat honey with expensive, newly accessible Eastern spices, such as black pepper, cinnamon, and dried ginger, to create dense, heavy loaves of spiced bread. This innovation birthed the first specialized gingerbread. The production process required extraordinary physical labor, forcing journeymen to knead massive, stiff troughs of honey-soaked dough that frequently had to age in cool cellars for months before baking to achieve the proper texture and chemical leavening. Artisans carved elaborate, highly detailed wooden molds depicting patron saints, heraldic shields, and charging knights to press the thick dough into intricate shapes. To protect their lucrative recipes and control regional markets, these master bakers organized themselves into highly exclusive, militarized professional guilds. In prosperous free imperial cities like Nuremberg, the Lebkuchen bakers established rigid monopolies over the production and distribution of commercial spiced honey bread. They constructed opulent guild halls, amassed considerable political influence within the city councils, and enforced strict quality controls. Guild masters fiercely guarded their proprietary spice blends and severely punished any rival baker caught diluting the honey with cheap fruit syrups. These powerful guilds produced gingerbread not merely as a festive confection, but as a crucial, highly engineered survival ration. Due to the natural preservative qualities of the honey and the antimicrobial properties of the imported spices, a properly baked loaf of gingerbread could remain edible for years without molding, rotting, or spoiling. Consequently, European quartermasters began purchasing these dense, calorie-heavy honey cakes in massive bulk quantities to supply their marching armies. Infantrymen packed the hard, durable loaves into their leather satchels, relying on the concentrated carbohydrates to sustain them during grueling winter campaigns when fresh forage proved impossible. Similarly, the Church explicitly encouraged the consumption of gingerbread among the thousands of religious pilgrims traversing the dangerous, desolate mountainous routes leading to Santiago de Compostela or Rome. A single block of heavily spiced honey bread provided enough caloric energy to sustain a walking pilgrim for several days without adding significant weight to their pack, cementing the baked product as a vital logistical tool for both the military and the rapidly expanding religious tourism networks of the High Middle Ages. While the urban guilds industrialized honey for the marching masses, the Northern European nobility actively sought new methods to elevate their native sweetener and counter the rising cultural dominance of imported Mediterranean cane sugar. The aristocracy refused to abandon their deeply ingrained cultural affinity for mead and honey-based alcohol, but they recognized the absolute need to refine their beverages to match the sophisticated tastes returning from the Crusades. They engineered a highly potent, fiercely expensive spiced honey wine known as Hippocras. Vintners blended the finest regional red or white grape wines with massive, overwhelming volumes of freshly clarified apiary honey, creating a fiercely intoxicating base liquid. To finalize the luxurious beverage, servants crushed fortunes worth of imported nutmeg, cloves, and mace, stirring the raw, powdered spices directly into the honeyed wine. They then poured the thick, highly aromatic mixture through a specialized conical cloth filter known as a Hippocratic sleeve, repeating the tedious straining process until the liquid ran perfectly clear and jewel-toned. Noble hosts served Hippocras at the climax of lavish state banquets, pouring the deeply sweet liquor into gilded chalices to conclude complex diplomatic negotiations or celebrate royal marriages. The creation of this specialized drink allowed the northern elite to display their immense purchasing power by consuming exorbitant quantities of foreign spices, while remaining firmly culturally tethered to the honey harvested from their own ancestral estates. As the medical, culinary, and military demand for honey continued to accelerate simultaneously across the continent, the existing agricultural infrastructure severely strained under the unprecedented pressure. The enclosed monastic apiaries and the small village skeps could no longer satisfy the insatiable requirements of the university apothecaries, the powerful gingerbread guilds, and the sprawling aristocratic banquet halls. To extract the vast quantities of sweetener and wax required to sustain this booming high medieval economy, professional harvesters realized they had to push much deeper into the primeval, untamed woodlands covering the frontiers of Eastern and Central Europe. Heavily armed men began marching past the cultivated fields and the safety of the village commons, entering the dark, contested forest canopy where the wild bee colonies thrived in the hollows of ancient oak trees, completely unaware that the rapidly expanding human population would soon turn the silent timberlands into violently disputed, fiercely militarized territories. During the 13th century, an unprecedented demographic explosion swept across the European continent. To feed this rapidly expanding population, feudal lords and ambitious abbots initiated aggressive, massive land-clearing campaigns. Teams of laborers armed with iron axes and crosscut saws marched into the ancient old-growth woodlands, felling centuries-old oaks to carve out new arable farmland. As the tree line rapidly receded, the vital foraging grounds for both wild bee colonies and local peasants shrank drastically. Simultaneously, the regional nobility began strictly enclosing the remaining primeval forests. Dukes and counts erected boundary markers, declared the dense timberlands their exclusive private hunting reserves, and deployed armed foresters to block commoners from entering. This aggressive enclosure abruptly severed rural communities from their traditional honey foraging rights. Desperate peasants, facing severe caloric deficits and mounting feudal taxation, openly defied the new edicts. They trespassed deep into the restricted woodlands under the cover of darkness, violently clashing with the manorial guards. Skirmishes erupted beneath the forest canopy as commoners fought armored retainers over the legal ownership of hollow, bee-filled logs. Within the dense, contested woodlands of the Holy Roman Empire, a specialized class of professional forest beekeepers emerged to capitalize on the escalating regional conflicts. Unlike the monks tending domestic skeps within walled gardens, these woodsmen operated entirely within the wild canopy. They tracked feral swarms deep into the imperial forests of Franconia and Bavaria, scaling massive pine and oak trees using heavy ropes and spiked iron climbing spurs. Suspended 60 feet above the forest floor, they utilized specialized short axes to carve deep, artificial cavities directly into the living trunks of the trees. They fitted these high-altitude hives with heavy wooden doors sealed with pine pitch, creating secure environments for the bees to build massive, heavy combs. To protect these scattered, highly vulnerable hives from the dual threats of roving poachers and European brown bears, these forest beekeepers abandoned their solitary practices. They organized themselves into exclusive, militarized professional guilds known as the Zidler. The Zidler transformed forest apiculture into a heavily armed enterprise. Operating out of heavily fortified forest settlements, particularly around the free imperial city of Nuremberg, these woodsmen formed tightly knit brotherhoods bound by strict oaths of loyalty. They adopted a distinctive uniform consisting of thick, heavy green wool coats designed to deflect both angry swarms and the damp forest chill, paired with wide-brimmed hats draped in dense linen netting. Recognizing that an unprotected forester carrying 50 pounds of premium honey presented an easy target for desperate bandits, the guild masters demanded that their members carry steel-tipped spears and heavy hunting knives at all times. The Zidler patrolled their designated forest tracts in organized squadrons, violently repelling unauthorized peasants and rival timbermen who attempted to fell trees containing active hives. Their aggressive defense of the imperial forests effectively secured a massive, uninterrupted supply of wax and honey, directly feeding the booming urban markets and the highly profitable gingerbread guilds operating within the city walls. The strategic and economic value of this armed apiculture guilds soon attracted the direct intervention of the imperial crown. In AD 1350, Emperor Charles IV, the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, officially recognized the Zeitler as an indispensable asset to the state. Bypassing the regional nobility who sought to tax the woodsmen, the sovereign issued a royal charter granting the guild unprecedented, sweeping legal privileges. He designated the Zeitler as direct imperial subjects, answering only to the crown. The charter granted them exclusive, permanent foraging rights across vast tracts of the imperial forests, explicitly forbidding local lords from interfering with their daily operations. Furthermore, Charles granted the guild the authority to establish their own independent judicial tribunals. These specialized courts, known as the Zeitelgericht, possessed the absolute legal power to try, convict, and punish anyone caught stealing honey, cutting down a marked bee tree, or attacking a guild member, completely circumventing the local manorial magistrates. Most remarkably, the imperial decree of 1350 granted the Zeitler the exclusive, highly restricted legal right to bear crossbows. In the deeply stratified society of the 14th century, medieval law heavily restricted the possession of advanced mechanical weaponry, generally reserving crossbows for professional mercenary companies and noble garrisons. By arming the forest beekeepers with this lethal, armor-piercing technology, the emperor effectively transformed the guild into a sanctioned paramilitary border patrol. The green-coated woodsmen slung heavy, steel-lathed crossbows over their shoulders as they scaled the ancient pines. They utilized the weapons to hunt the massive bears that decimated their hives and to execute lethal force against armed poachers. In exchange for these extraordinary privileges, the crown demanded a strict annual tribute of wax for the royal court and required the Zeitler to serve as specialized military skirmishers in the imperial army whenever foreign forces threatened the borders of the empire. Following the militarized blueprint of the Holy Roman Empire, similar apiculture guilds rapidly established absolute dominance across the vast, primeval forests of Eastern Europe. In the sprawling woodlands of the Kingdom of Poland, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and the medieval Russian principalities, professional tree beekeepers formed powerful, autonomous brotherhoods. Operating in an environment far more isolated and dangerous than their Western counterparts, these Eastern woodsmen managed tens of thousands of hollow tree hives spread across thousands of square miles of dense wilderness. To maintain absolute order over this massive, decentralized agricultural network, the Eastern guilds established ruthless, unforgiving penal codes. The legal statutes governing the Polish and Lithuanian forests specifically classified the destruction of a marked bee tree as a capital offense, legally equating the crime with murder or high treason against the state. The guilds treated the massive oak and pine trees not as mere timber, but as highly engineered, living agricultural assets. The Eastern guilds strictly enforced these brutal laws through their own specialized forest tribunals. Guild executioners dragged convicted honey thieves deep into the woods to face grotesque, highly symbolic public executions. Depending on the specific regional jurisdiction, magistrates frequently ordered the condemned to be hanged directly from the stout branches of the exact oak tree they had attempted to rob. In other Slavic territories, executioners utilized a specialized brutal procedure where they tied the poacher to the trunk of the violated bee tree and disemboweled him, leaving the body exposed as a terrifying, visceral warning to other desperate foragers. This extreme application of lethal force effectively deterred organized banditry, allowing the Eastern guilds to maximize their harvest. They extracted staggering volumes of dark, thick forest honey and rendered thousands of tons of high-quality beeswax from the ancient timberlands, creating a massive surplus that far exceeded local consumption. This immense, highly secured Eastern surplus directly intersected with the rapidly expanding commercial networks of the Hanseatic League. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, this powerful confederation of Northern European merchant guilds dominated maritime, trade across the Baltic and North Seas. Hanseatic merchants recognized the massive arbitrage opportunity presented by the wild Russian and Polish forest harvests. The urban centers of Western Europe suffered from an acute, perpetual shortage of wax to satisfy the insatiable liturgical demands of the church and enough honey to fuel their expanding populations. The Hanseatic League systematically constructed massive, fortified stone warehouses in key Baltic port cities such as Danzig, Riga, and Novgorod specifically to stockpile the products of the Eastern Forest Guilds. Heavily guarded wagon trains rolled out of the deep Lithuanian and Russian forests, delivering tens of thousands of heavy oak barrels filled with liquid honey directly to the docks. Dockworkers utilized complex pulley systems to load this heavy cargo into the holds of deep-draft Hanseatic cogs. These massive, square-rigged merchant vessels sailed in heavily armed convoys across the treacherous Baltic waters, defending their lucrative agricultural shipments against roving bands of maritime pirates. Upon reaching the bustling western ports, the merchants auctioned the Baltic forest honey to wealthy urban syndicates, royal purveyors, and master apothecaries. This vast, highly organized international shipping network functioned as the primary caloric artery of Northern Europe, successfully transporting thousands of tons of wild sweetener hundreds of miles from the contested eastern woodlands to the tables of the Western aristocracy. The Hanseatic captains generated staggering profits from this continuous logistical operation, building opulent brick mansions and funding the construction of massive Gothic cathedrals across the Baltic coast using the silver earned from the forest harvest. Yet even as the heavily armed foresters patrolled the Slavic timberlands and the Hanseatic cogs dominated the Baltic shipping lanes, a profound geopolitical shift was quietly taking shape far to the south. The massive, complex infrastructure built to defend, harvest, and transport European forest honey had reached its absolute zenith. Beyond the Mediterranean Sea, Portuguese maritime explorers had begun pushing their caravels past the familiar coastal waters of North Africa, charting deep into the unexplored, turbulent currents of the open Atlantic Ocean. Seeking to bypass the established Italian and Islamic trade monopolies entirely, these navigators carried heavy iron agricultural tools and carefully wrapped cuttings of Levantine sugarcane, actively searching for fertile, uninhabited volcanic islands capable of supporting a radically different kind of economic empire. In 1432, Portuguese maritime explorers operating under the direct patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator aggressively expanded the geographical borders of the known European economy. Navigators sailing heavy, lateen-rigged wooden caravels pushed far beyond the familiar Iberian coastline, dropping heavy iron anchors off the volcanic archipelagos of Madeira and the Azores. Finding these remote islands entirely uninhabited and completely blanketed by dense, primeval laurel forests, the Portuguese immediately initiated a massive campaign of environmental engineering. Colonial laborers slashed and burned thousands of acres of ancient timber, clearing the steep, ash-rich mountain slopes to construct complex, irrigated agricultural terraces known as lavadas. Seeking a highly profitable export crop to justify the immense financial cost of these dangerous maritime expeditions, colonial administrators imported mature sugarcane cuttings directly from Sicily and the Levant. They planted the heavy green stalks deep into the fertile, sun-baked volcanic soil of the Atlantic islands, watering them continuously through the newly carved mountain channels. This calculated agricultural decision effectively shifted the epicenter of European sugar production out of the contested, Islamic-controlled Mediterranean basin and firmly into the open ocean. To process the rapidly expanding sugarcane harvests, Portuguese colonial governors constructed massive, industrial-scale milling complexes known as engenhos. These sophisticated facilities required an unprecedented, continuous volume of manual labor to operate the heavy iron crushers and tend the scorching, perpetually burning boiling houses. Abandoning traditional European peasant labor entirely, Portuguese merchants sailed their armed caravels southward along the West African coast, systematically purchasing thousands of enslaved Africans from regional warlords. Traders packed these human captives tightly into the stifling, disease-ridden hulls of their ships, transporting them across the ocean currents to forcefully work the Madeira and Azores plantations. The establishment of this brutal, slave-based agricultural system allowed the colonial elite to completely bypass the high wage costs and seasonal limitations of free labor. Enslaved workers swung heavy iron machetes under the blistering Atlantic sun, harvesting millions of tons of raw cane. Exhausted mill hands then fed the crushed stalks into massive copper vats, continuously skimming the boiling, toxic sap until it crystallized into raw sugar, fueling an economic machine built entirely on human suffering and unrelenting physical labor. This industrialized, Atlantic plantation economy produced refined sweetener on a scale previously unimaginable to the medieval world. Heavily laden Portuguese galleons routinely departed the island ports, their deep wooden holds packed tightly with thousands of heavy, conical loaves of pure white sugar. When these armed maritime convoys arrived at the massive commercial hubs of Lisbon and Antwerp, the sheer, unprecedented volume of their cargo completely shattered the existing European market monopolies. The price of imported cane sugar, once an ultra-expensive pharmaceutical luxury reserved exclusively for royal banquets and the highest strata of the nobility, plummeted rapidly. Spice merchants operating in the bustling urban centers of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire began selling affordable blocks of refined sugar directly to the rapidly emerging merchant class. Wealthy burghers, successful tradesmen, and prosperous guild masters eagerly purchased the imported sweetener, utilizing it to replicate the lavish desserts, fruit preserves, and elaborate, towering table centerpieces previously denied to them by exorbitant costs. Sugar transitioned permanently from a rare, imported medical curiosity into a widely consumed, highly demanded domestic staple. As cheap Atlantic sugar continuously flooded the continent, the economic foundation of the European apiculture industry began to severely fracture. Urban bakers quickly realized that refined sugar provided a cleaner, much more predictable chemical reaction in their ovens than heavy, temperamental forest honey, which frequently varied in moisture content. Apothecaries adjusted their ancient Galenic recipes, aggressively substituting the crisp white powder for the viscous golden syrup when compounding their medicinal electuaries and preserving bitter herbs. However, the true catastrophic blow to the traditional honey economy arrived not from the colonial merchant fleets, but from the fiery pulpits of Northern Europe. In 1517, a relatively obscure Augustinian monk named Martin Luther publicly challenged the theological authority of the Catholic Church, nailing his revolutionary 95 Theses to the heavy wooden doors of the castle church in Wittenberg. This defiant, localized action ignited the Protestant Reformation, a sweeping religious upheaval that systematically dismantled the established ecclesiastical order across half the continent, severely disrupting the complex, continent-wide supply chains that had sustained the medieval world for centuries. Protestant reformers aggressively targeted the opulent physical rituals and expensive liturgical requirements of medieval Catholicism. Theologians utilized the newly invented printing press to disseminate massive, widely read sermons denouncing the veneration of saints, the elaborate decoration of the sanctuaries, and the mandatory use of expensive religious artifacts. Among their primary targets was the strict Catholic mandate requiring pure beeswax candles for the celebration of the Massachusetts radical Protestant leaders, including John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli, dismissed the deeply ingrained theological association between worker bees and the virginity of Mary as baseless, idolatrous superstition. They ordered their fiercely loyal congregations to physically strip the high altars of their ornate golden candelabras and smash the associated stained glass windows. In newly reformed churches across Germany, Switzerland, and Scandinavia, Humble tallow candles made from sheep fat or simple oil lamps permanently replaced the fragrant, highly expensive beeswax tapers. The sudden, absolute elimination of this centuries-old liturgical requirement instantly annihilated the largest, most reliable institutional market for European wax, leaving producers with massive, unsellable inventories. The profound theological shift triggered an immediate, devastating economic collapse across the vast network of monastic and guild apiaries. In England, King Henry VIII officially broke with the spiritual authority of Rome and initiated the brutal, systematic dissolution of the monasteries. Royal commissioners rode relentlessly across the countryside, physically seizing the vast territorial wealth of the Catholic abbeys, stripping the valuable lead from their roofs, melting down their bronze bells, and violently evicting the resident monastic populations. The specialized, heavily walled bee enclosures that had stood securely for centuries were abruptly abandoned, their meticulously managed hives left to starve during the winter or swarm uncontrollably into the surrounding wilderness. Without the massive guaranteed wax purchases from the cathedrals and abbeys, the highly organized continental apiculture economy completely disintegrated. The Zeitler and other militarized forest guilds lost their primary source of imperial revenue. Unable to sell their massive wax surpluses to a rapidly secularizing society, these once powerful brotherhoods rapidly bankrupted, their independent judicial courts dissolved, and their exclusive crossbow privileges formally revoked by the newly empowered secular authorities. By the late 16th century, the widespread availability of cheap plantation sugar and the catastrophic collapse of the ecclesiastical wax market permanently displaced the bee from the center of European geopolitics. The massive, highly organized wagon trains of the Hanseatic League ceased transporting Baltic forest honey, pivoting their formidable logistical networks toward more profitable, reliable cargoes of grain, salted herring, and raw timber destined for the growing Atlantic ports. The heavily armed woodsmen completely vanished from the Slavic timberlands, their forest courts forgotten, and the intricate stone bee bowls built into the abbey walls slowly crumbled into overgrown, moss-covered ruin. Refined cane sugar fully conquered the European diet, directly dictating the aggressive expansion of global maritime empires and driving the transatlantic slave trade to horrific new heights. Honey, the vital caloric engine that had physically sustained marching armies, funded massive feudal empires, and illuminated the holiest manuscripts of the Middle Ages, suffered a profound, irreversible demotion. It faded rapidly from a highly taxed, heavily guarded state asset back into a simple, localized rural commodity managed by isolated peasants. The grand, violent era of the militarized medieval apiaries quietly drew to a definitive close. The relentless, organized hum of millions of managed bees, which had once directly dictated the agricultural planning of kings, emperors, and abbots, retreated permanently to the quiet corners of peasant orchards and wild forest hollows. For over 1,000 years, following the sudden, violent collapse of the Roman logistical networks, the people of Europe had looked entirely to the hive for their physical survival, their wound medicine, and their sacred light. They had built towering stone fortresses to protect their swarms from bears and bandits, fought bloody skirmishes under the dark forest canopy for the legal rights to hollow trees, and bound their absolute feudal loyalties over silver cups of potent, aged mead. Yet, as heavily armed European galleons pushed outward into the Atlantic and fierce theological fires swept across the continent, the age of honey supremacy inevitably fractured. The modern world would be fueled by the bitter, heavily industrialized harvest of the transatlantic cane fields, leaving the golden syrup of the Middle Ages behind as a fading, sweet memory of a vastly different time. If history fascinates you, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more stories waiting to be told.